Hello, class. This is the lecture that was scheduled for April the 13th on Israelis and Palestinians. Where we last left that conflict was the civil war in Lebanon. And during that civil war, as I mentioned, the United States intervened to negotiate a withdrawal of Palestinian forces from Lebanon and their removal to Tunisia. And then in 1984, the Americans themselves withdrew from Lebanon, and the Lebanese civil war then simmered on for another 6 years before the Taif Accords ended the fighting. But what we want to talk about today, is the Palestinian-Israeli struggle. And up until this time, roughly, well, I would say up until the Egyptian peace treaty with Israel, remember, which came in 1979. Up until that, we had called it the Arab-Israeli conflict because all of the Arab states had been involved. But after this, historians and other commentators at the time started to call it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because with Egypt out of the actual war or war footing, even they had declared peace, so they were not even a truce, it was a full-scale peace. The Arab states did not have the ability to wage a war with Israel. And so it became a conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. And that's where we are today. So what I prepared for you a timeline, and it'd be useful probably if you had it out. I don't know whether you can print in where you are, but at least look at it at some point while you're listening to this, because it lays it out much more clearly than I may skip something over. Whereas I thought it fairly carefully to put what were the important developments. But the main theme is to think about all the missed opportunities, because you had at the beginning the United Nations issuing 242, which would have meant that the Israelis withdrew from most of the territories that they had occupied, and that would mean that the West Bank and Gaza Strip would be under Palestinian, or at least at that point, they thought it would be under Jordanian administration. But that fell through. The Arab states said no to that. They rejected it completely, any possibility of a compromise. Because at that time, they still were reeling from 1947, and I think they just felt that it was politically impossible for them to, to make a peace treaty with Israel. We saw that Egypt then under Anwar Sadat took by himself, he decided that Egypt would go its own way and that they figured out a way to make a peace treaty. For the other Arab states, I would say in part it was because they used it, especially in the case of Syria and Iraq. The military governments in both countries used it as a kind of, why are we in power? Why are we controlling everything? Well, we're necessary. We are necessary to eventually liberate Palestine from the Israelis. And so their peoples could take it. I don't think they took it all that serious. They didn't believe it, but half believed it, half didn't believe it. In other words, at one time you could ask a Syrian or Iraqi, is this really what the government is in your best interest to pursue the war against Israel? And they say yes. And another time you'd ask them, they say no, because it means we have to go through all this kind of shortages and we have to go through a police state and all these kinds of things. So the propaganda in the Arab world, the radio, popular opinion, especially in places like Jordan, where you had large Palestinian population, popular opinion did favor the continuing struggle against Israel. But on the fringes in North Africa and even in Syria and Iraq, people were starting to think, is it worth the trouble? The Lebanese civil war highlighted that even more. Arab watching in other places saw Arabs killing Arabs, and that seemed to, negate the whole idea of Arab unity. And so they were slow. It was slow for the Arabs to take initiative. And in the meantime, and this is the key, I think what's key here, is that you get the development in the 70s and then the 80s of a much stronger movement in Israel, which itself rejects any agreement with the Palestinians because it wants what they call Greater Israel. It wants control of all of what they say is biblical Israel, that is from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. including Gaza and the Golan Heights. And that becomes stronger and stronger. I mean, initially it is a nationalist, a secular nationalist movement following Jabotinsky. Remember, Jabotinsky had said that that's pretty much the boundaries, and that the Palestinian, or the Arabs, he didn't call them Palestinians, the Arabs living there pretty much had to get out. And so starting in the late 70s and the early 80s, you began what's called the religious Zionist movement. And these people were much more fervent in their desire to hold on to the West Bank, because they saw that as the biblical home of the Jews. And therefore, if the Jews were going to be anywhere in Israel, the land of Israel, then they should be in the West Bank. And so you get a militant settler organization. And remember, the Israeli politics are such that almost any government needs coalition. And this group, although what we call the settler movement, although it never had more, or still never has more than, say, a half a dozen to a dozen members of parliament out of 120, it's still enough that, especially the right uses them. The left never, Labor never would go into coalition, because Labor's idea always has been some kind of solution with 242 as the principle. And so we'll talk about how it developed, how Labor continues to push that idea against the growing right in Israel, which doesn't want to make any compromise with the Palestinians. Okay, and then also the other part that we have to keep track of is the United States. When Democrats are in power, historically they're very pro-Israel, Democratic Party, because it has a lot of support from American Jews and liberal Americans. Those two groups, those two demographic groups, liberals generally, American Jewish population secondarily, often they overlap, but those two groups were strong supporters of Israel as a democratic state. And so Democratic Party tended to support Israel. What you get, and the Republicans sometimes were with the Arabs, especially because of the Saudis, but we're going to see with Bush, George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, you finally get an American president who stands up to Israel a little bit, and it's on the settlers, a settle movement. It's on the idea that Israel does not have the right to establish settlements in the West Bank, because under national law, that was territory taken in war. And under national law, you cannot do anything to a population that you've conquered by war. You can't expel them. You can't take their land away from them. And so the United States officially, until the Trump administration, American governments have consistently said that the West Bank settlements are illegal, and that although it's up to the Palestinians and the Israelis to negotiate a final settlement, that in the view of the American government, that is up until President Trump, those settlements were illegal and would have to be either negotiated with the Palestinians, something the Palestinians could agree on, or they would have to be removed. So that was the American official status. So we go back to the 1980s. The PLO has moved to Tunis. It looks like it's pretty much at a standstill. Labor is still in power in Israel until 1986, and in 1986, Likud comes to power, and they are led by Yitzhak Shamir. He's on your list. So that's 1986. Yitzhak Shamir, Likud. So the Begin had been in power, and his party was called the Herut Party. It reforms and gives itself a new name. It's now called Likud, and it has Begin's chief lieutenant was Yitzhak Shamir. So he goes back to the Irgun days. He was a refugee from Nazi Poland, and joined the Irgun against the British, and then was in right-wing politics up until the time that he becomes prime minister. So you have a right-wing government in Israel and not willing to compromise with the Palestinians. And the Palestinians then seem to be incredibly irrelevant in Tunis. They don't have any border with Israel. There is some raiding. I mean, there's some attacks mounted either from Gaza or the West Bank, which are both under Israeli control. So there is a time of relative peace in Israel, that they don't have to worry about the Arabs, and they actually don't think about it. But then in December of 1987, there is a traffic accident in Gaza Strip, at the Israeli checkpoint. An Israeli truck comes barreling through and kills a couple of Palestinians. That sets off strikes. And these strikes are called collectively in Arabic the Intifada. It's on your list. And the Intifada lasted basically from 1987 through the Gulf War, the first American war with Iraq, and then it quieted down during that period because of very strict Israeli martial law in both Gaza and the West Bank. And so what was it? It was basically a grassroots response to Israeli occupation. So Israelis had been in Gaza and in the West Bank for almost 20 years. So a whole young generation had grown up under Israeli direct rule with almost no political rights whatsoever, very limited economic rights. Basically, the only right they had was to work as day laborers in Israel or to be farmers. Or small industry was growing in the West Bank, but not much. So it was pretty much the main labor market for the Palestinians, especially for Gaza, but even for the West Bank, was that they had to go to Israel and work as day laborers, so construction workers, garbage workers, waiters in restaurants, things like that. The kind of underclass economy of Israel in the 80s, that was done by Palestinians from either Gaza or the West Bank. All right, so the strike says, well, don't go work in Israel. It also says, let's close down everything at noon. So get all your shopping done in the morning, and then all the stores, everything will close down at noon. Universities will close down, schools will close down. They didn't have virtual education the way you have it, so they basically had to conduct it in secret in basements and things like that. And Palestinians started to grow gardens in their backyards for food, because the whole idea was not to take anything from the Israeli economy, just to shut down and show that we as Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, we speak for ourselves. And this took not only the Israelis by surprise, it took the PLO by surprise. They had just assumed that the people in the West Bank and Gaza would just accept whatever they said, speaking for the Palestinians. And what the Intifada said is, no, you have to speak to the Palestinians who are living under the occupation. That this is, they have agency, they have political sophistication, and they have a desire. So they had the leadership, or it sprung up, it was kind of amazing in retrospect how it did spring up, because there's no internet back then. There's only telephone. Telephone is heavily controlled by the Israeli censors. But it spread, maybe word of mouth. I don't know. I wasn't there. I was there actually briefly. Wesleyan used to have a program, Wesleyan in Jerusalem, and the students asked me to come over. They wanted someone not Israeli to give a week-long series of lectures on the Palestinians, and so they didn't want to hire a Palestinian to do that, so they hired me. So I went over to Israel for a week. It was spring. In fact, it was a week before Holy Week. Because I was there for Palm Sunday in Jerusalem. For me, that was very moving. But anyway, I was there for a week giving lectures on Palestinians, and that was the time of the Intifada. So I stayed in a very nice Palestinian. Wesley didn't pay me any money. They just gave me a very big expense account. So I stayed in a lovely old hotel in the Arab part of Jerusalem. And that meant that I had to come back when I came back at noon, everything was closed down, but luckily the hotel still served meals. And I also got a chance to talk to a lot of people in the hotel, that the staff, and then other people would sneak into the hotel, basically breaking the boycott by coming into the hotel to have dinner and at the bar. So I met a lot of Palestinian intellectuals at that time. But anyway, so I saw it at work, and it was very effective. I mean, it just really did close down. There seemed to be an awful lot of solidarity among the Palestinians. Again, like I said, I'm not sure how the word spread, word of mouth. Had to be mostly because there was a Palestinian newspaper that was being published, but there was very limited ways of contact. But then, the Palestinians live pretty close together, both in Gaza. Now it's 2 million people, the size of half of Manhattan, so very densely populated. In maybe it's even a quarter. It's it's 10 miles by 2 miles. I'm not sure how big Manhattan is. So it's roughly 20 square miles. So it's a very small area with 2 million people living in it. So clearly they have no trouble communicating. But in the West Bank, where there are villages, scattered villages, it might be hard. But anyway, there was communication, and it was pretty uniform. And the leadership that sprang up, it was a young generation, people who were born, many of them under occupation or grew up under occupation. The average age of the leadership was in the late 20s, early 30s. So it was very much a youth movement. And they made it very clear that there would be no weapons used, that there would be stones. So Palestinians threw stones at Israelis, and Israelis were killed. There weren't large numbers. It's hard to get numbers on this, how many people died, but it was, by the time the Intifada had basically petered out, it was over 1,000 Palestinians had been killed by Israelis, and probably 100 or so Israelis had been killed, mostly by traffic. Israelis in the West Bank, Palestinians would get up on the hillsides overlooking the roads that the Israelis used, Israeli settlers used, or the army, and they would throw rocks at them. So they broke windshields and people died in crashes. So, but there was no bombing, there was no shooting. I think there were some stabbings, but there was no wide-scale violence, unlike the Second Intifada, which will break out at in 2000. But it basically ends with the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, which I'll talk about in the next lecture. But it did send us a message to everybody that the Palestinians in Palestine had to be taken seriously. It was a game changer. The PLO then began to organize more in the West Bank and tried to organize in Gaza. And at the same time, you get a new movement. And there's a big debate on this movement. The movement appears during the time of the Intifada. It first forms in 1988. And we know it by its initials, or its an acronym, HAMAS, probably heard of it. And that stands for, if you take the Arabic name for it, it's Harakat, Muqawama, al-Islamiyya. So the movement of Islamic resistance, or you can translate it Islamic resistance movement. You can translate it any way we want to, because the order in Arabic doesn't really mean anything. There are all the adjectives. It could be either the Islamic could either be the Islamic resistance or the Islamic movement of resistance, because it's not clear which noun it modifies. But anyway, you take it together, and remember Fatah, we should have had Hataf, but that means death. We don't want to call Fatah Hataf. So we tend in Arabic, we take the three letters of the initials for it, and then we add vowels, and we make a word out of it. And so Hamas means zeal, Z-E-A-L. So it's, better than Hataf, right? So zeal, so it's Islamic resistance movement. But notice, the Fatah meant the movement to liberate Palestine. So the key word in Fatah's name is Palestine. The key idea, besides resistance, in Hamas is Islamiyya. So whereas Fatah promoted itself as a non-sectarian nationalist organization, in the tradition of Arab nationalism, Hamas is clearly saying that it is an Islamic organization. It shouldn't surprise us, because Gaza is one of the more traditional parts of the Palestinian population, and also it was under Egyptian control until 1967, and so the Islamic Brotherhood was much more strongly represented in Gaza than it was in the West Bank. It did exist in the West Bank, but it was much stronger in Gaza, the Gaza region. And that becomes then the stronghold of Hamas movement. Now, the origins is controversial. Some people say that it was actually started by the Israelis, because the Israelis wanted another movement to counter Fatah. During the Intifada, they thought that an Islamic movement might divide the Palestinians, and that's a good idea to have, if they're divided, if they aren't speaking with one voice, because the Palestinians were, during the beginning of the Intifada, they were speaking with one voice. We want civil rights, is what they're demanding of the Israelis. They're not saying we want, drive you into the sea. We're not saying anything. Not really saying we want civil rights. But unfortunately, they did it they did use some violence. There were many of them who said, no, we should follow Dr. Martin Luther King and make this solely, or Mahatma Gandhi, and make this solely nonviolent. But there was violence, and no one denies it. Hamas, on the other hand, said, yes, there has to be violence. So Hamas distinguishes themselves from the other Palestinians in the Intifada, because the other Palestinians are saying we're fighting for civil rights in West Bank and Gaza. And Hamas is saying, no, we're fighting to destroy Israel. And so you get basically two extremes. On the Israeli side, you have the settler movement, both religious and nationalist, which says we're no compromise with the Palestinians. We're going to keep the West Bank, and we're going to keep it so under such tight control that the Palestinians will immigrate. They'll leave. I'll come back to that in a minute, that idea of leaving. And then on the other hand, you have Hamas who says, no, we're going to fight. We're going to liberate all of Israel. We're going to set up an Islamic state and everywhere. It's no compromise. So you have two sides on each side, on the Palestinians and the Israelis. You have voices that say no compromise. And that's important to keep in mind. That it's on both sides. Okay, so with the one of the things that the Americans held out as a kind of a carrot to the Arabs to come in on the side of the United States in the conflict with Iraq, which I'll talk about in the next lecture, was that they would hold a Middle East peace conference. And everyone who had participated, at least by boycotting or breaking off relations with Iraq, which ended up being all the Arab countries but Jordan and Libya, would be invited to attend a Middle East peace summit in Madrid in 1991. And that was set up by George H.W. Bush. And the Palestinians were told that if they recognized the state of Israel, they could come. And they didn't at this point. They didn't announce that. Although they had said, going back to 1988, they had said that they would be willing to negotiate with Israel based on 242. So they thought that was sufficient. And in the end, the Americans did allow them to send a delegation. It wasn't an official Fatah delegation, but it was a group of Palestinian intellectuals who were allowed to attend the Madrid conference. And they did so because the Fatah, our PLO, had said they would accept 242. They didn't accept the existence of Israel yet. They were holding that out. But they would accept 242. How they were going to do that without accepting the existence of Israel is, a bit problematic, but they were there. But what that set in motion, then the negotiations, and the Arab states then pretty much, it wasn't officially announced until, I think I have it here on your date, that it's the so-called Saudi, I can't see the data, maybe it's down further. They eventually will say that the Arab states will say that if there is a 242 is implemented, then they will recognize Israel fully and exchange diplomatic relations. And that is the stance the Arab states have taken since the 1990s. So they've been willing that anytime Israel would negotiate with the Palestinians on where out of the West Bank they would withdraw, the Arab states, other Arab states, all the ones who signed on, and the only one who didn't sign on, Jordan eventually, although it was supporting Iraq diplomatically during the American invasion of American, they didn't invade them this time. The American war with Iraq over Kuwait in 1991, they did say they would recognize Israel if a peace treaty were to come about. So they were there as well. So basically it's everybody but Libya and Iraq. And Iraq was in shambles at this point. So all the Arab states said that they were willing. And so what started was a group of Israeli intellectuals and Palestinian intellectuals were meeting in Oslo, Norway, and discussing what would a peace plan look like. And they came out with what was called the Oslo Accords in 1992, which is basically mutual recognition that the Palestinians would recognize the state of Israel as existing in the 1967 boundaries as a sovereign state, would make no claim on that territory, And the Israelis would recognize the PLO as the official spokesperson, voice of the Palestinians. The Israelis did not recognize that there would be a Palestinian state. So it was mutual, it's called the mutual recognition, but it wasn't actually equal. It was asymmetrical recognition. That is, the Palestinians recognized Israel. The Israelis did not recognize Palestine. They recognized the PLO was the legitimate spokesperson for the Palestinian people, but they made no commitment to a Palestine. So that then led to further negotiations that Bill Clinton organized, and you ended up in 1993, you end up with the United States then hosting them at various times, and that speeds up the process. One of the key parts was in 1993, the Jordanians recognized, well, first step was that Israel said that the PLO, having recognized Israel, could return to Palestine. And so they gave the PLO the right to set up in both Gaza, which is the part that the Israelis were really, although there were Israeli settlements in Gaza, the Israelis were pretty eager to get rid of Gaza. And here was 2 million kind of very impoverished Palestinians, and they didn't really want to have responsibility for them. So they let the Palestinians take over Gaza, and then the city of Jericho on the West Bank. Jericho is on the Jordan. It's in the Jordan River Valley. It's fairly, it's an oasis town. So it's surrounded by pretty rugged, deserty land. So they thought that that would be pretty self-contained if the PLO was there. And so Yasser Arafat then moves from Tunis to Jericho, and Jericho then becomes the temporary administrative center for the PLO. Following that, King Husayn of Jordan says, okay, well, Israel, you have filled part of the movement toward recognizing the Palestinians. So we will enter into a peace treaty with you. We will show our good faith that we will sign a peace treaty with you, hoping that you will continue your negotiations with the Palestinians. And so they signed a peace treaty, and they exchanged ambassadors. An Israeli tourist could go to Jordan. It never was a really warm peace because the condition that the Jordanians thought that they were getting from the Israelis was that there would be a continued movement toward the establishment of a Palestinian state. And that, as we're going to see, had false starts and depended on who was in power, because already you have, as I said, you had Shamir was the head of Likud, and they really didn't want to go forward. And it only was when Labor then comes back into power, and Labor's prime minister was Yitzhak Rabin. And so you had the famous Oslo Accord agreement that was signed in Washington on the front lawn of the White House, where the Rose Garden, it's the backyard of the White House, where you had the famous meeting of no, it was the front. Take it back. It was the front now. Sorry, you see the columns. You had the famous meeting of Yitzhak Rabin, Yasser Arafat, and President Clinton. And President Clinton had to basically force Yitzhak Rabin to shake Arafat's hand. So if you could go on YouTube, you might want to Google that and see if you can get that, because it clearly he did not want to shake Arafat's hand, because as the Israelis said, Arafat had Israeli blood on his hands, so he was a terrorist, and they didn't want to have any semblance of close relations. But that agreement is signed, and that then led to a brief moment of optimism, because what it said under that agreement is that more areas of Palestine, or the West Bank, I should say, would be open up to Palestinian self-rule. So the towns of Nablus and Hebron, the main towns, Ramallah, which is has a large Christian minority, Bethlehem, again, which has a large Christian minority. They all had self-government. They had mayors that were elected 1996. There were several of them were then booby-trapped. Their cars were booby-trapped by right-wing Israeli extremists, and I think one was killed and several lost their legs. So there was a pushback from the Israeli right to this movement toward Palestinian self-rule. But then you had trouble in the north, and that is that Hezbollah, which had been formed during the Lebanese Civil War as a militia of the Shia and heavily funded by Iran, and actually, the orders come from Tehran. They had been engaging in attacks on the Israelis. Remember, the Israelis, when they withdrew from Lebanon in 1982, they did not withdraw from a 10-mile strip. Again, if you look at the map of Lebanon, there's a river in the southern part that runs pretty much parallel to the Israeli border. It's called the Litani River. The Israelis pulled south of the Litani River, but they still occupied villages in Lebanon. And so they had actually a town too, the town of Tyre was under Israeli occupation. And so the Hezbollah was attacking the Israelis in that strip, the Israeli army in that strip, and it then started shooting also rockets over the border into Israel proper at the agricultural settlements along the border that the Israelis had pretty much since the 47. And so Israel then, the government, which had just signed the treaty, or not a treaty, but agreement with the Palestinians, this is the government of Rabin, he had to look strong, because elections were scheduled, and so he invaded southern Lebanon in March and April. That was called Operation Grapes of Wrath. Again, the Israeli tanks poured into southern Lebanon. They did not cross above the Litani River. So the agreement that the Americans had brokered back in 82 held that the Israelis did not cross into north of the Litani River, but they did occupy again, or forcefully attack the bases of Hezbollah on the other side of the river and in the Bekaa Valley. They did not attack Beirut at that time. So it was a limited strike, but even so, it wasn't enough. And the Labor loses the election, and then Netanyahu, who had succeeded from Shamir, he becomes the president of Israel. Oh, I left out something important, and that is, and I just looked it over, after the Oslo Accord was signed in Washington, so that date is, I have it on the map, the sheet for you, is September 28th. November the 4th, after Rabin had signed that, the right wing became incredibly abusive of him. There were posters made up of him wearing a Nazi uniform. He was attacked by Netanyahu as a sellout to the people of Israel. And then on November the 4th, so, a month and 7 days after the signing of the agreement, he was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli who said his rabbi had told him to do it. He was given a relatively limited time in prison. I think it was 10 years is all he was given for the murder of the prime minister. And so the then prime minister was Ehud Barak, who had been head of the military for a while, a former military man, which is one of the things the Israelis tend to like. They like to have their political leaders be former generals. That way they think they're tough on the Arabs. So Barak was not a very charismatic man, and he lost the election, although he was the one that ordered the invasion. He thought that would strengthen labor with the more right-wing Israeli voters, but it didn't work. And so the prime minister then is Netanyahu in 96. And from 96 then until 99, there is no attempt by the Israeli government to talk to the Palestinians or to move the peace forward in any way, shape, or form. Then in 99, you get this weird moment of opportunity. That is, Ehud Barak gets reelected, forms a coalition, and he then becomes prime minister. And this is the last full year of of President Clinton, Bill Clinton's administration, and he really wants to leave a legacy. I mean, all presidents want to leave a legacy. His legacy he wanted to leave was the Israeli-Palestinian peace. So he calls a meeting at Camp David in the summer of 2000. So he's going to be up for election. I mean, not even going to be up for election. He's going to be going out of office in January 2001. So he's got basically 6 months left of his term. And he pushes for a peace treaty. And in the end, Arafat doesn't sign. And the Clinton administration lambast him. He says that it was him that was the reason. But if you look at, I think it's in your map, but if not, go to Google and Google it, and you can see what the agreement was. The agreement was much more limited than what the Palestinians had hoped for. It included most of the major settlements of the Israelis had established in the West Bank, where the map looks very strange. It's like a gerrymandered looking map. There are little sections of Israel that come into the West Bank. That's to include large sections of settlements. Some of the smaller settlements, the Israelis said, would be dismantled. But even so, they basically cut what would be the Palestinian state into two parts. It was not contiguous. So there was a northern part centered around the city of Hebron, and northern part centered around the city of Nablus, and a southern part around the city of Hebron, and then no bit of Jerusalem. And so for the Palestinians, the idea that nothing in Jerusalem, not even the outskirts of Jerusalem, the Arab parts of Jerusalem that aren't in the old city, not even those would be included, because they had already been annexed by the Israelis as part of unified Jerusalem. And so the Palestinians said, no, we can't accept this. This is complete humiliation. This is not a viable state. We agree not to have an army. We agree to have a small police force. They made all the agreements that the Israelis wanted, and they just felt that they'd given up Jerusalem. But they felt that the idea that this not having the state as being basically cut in two by Israeli control amounted to what they called a Bantustan. And the Bantustans were the homelands that in South Africa, they decided they would deal with their African population by kicking large numbers of them out of white areas and settling them in areas that were surrounded by white territory. And they were called Bantustans, lands where Bantu people can live. And so that whole idea of segregating people into cantons that are not contiguous, that is, they're basically surrounded by Israeli army with no direct way of getting back and forth, that was not acceptable to the Palestinians, and so they walked away. And there has been no agreement since then. So the blame may have fallen on Arafat. I mean, that's what I said. Clinton and his advisors, all their memoirs, they all very much condemn Arafat for not going all the way. But I think in part is they wanted so much to have a treaty that they're willing to take Israel's side, that the Israelis said this is the minimum that we will give up. This is the maximum we'll give up. Minimum that we want is what's here. This is it. No less than this. And so they wanted the Israelis on it, and they thought that the Palestinians, being in a much weaker position, which they were when the Palestinians had no army, the Palestinians didn't have the economy, but the Palestinians refused to accept it, and so it died. So you then have the Israelis. I'm sorry. Before the Israelis went to the agreement to talk, they did pull out of Lebanon, and in 2000. But they kept a section that's on your list. It's called the Sheba Farms, and the Sheba Farms, the Israelis said, were part of Syria, and therefore it was taken by during the '67 war. The Lebanese said no. That was disputed with the Syrians by the Lebanese government before the '67 war, and it had not been arbitrated. So it was before the World Court, and it hadn't been arbitrated. So it technically, in their mind, was still Lebanese territory. So that then justified the Lebanese government allowing Hezbollah to continue to be armed, because remember, Hezbollah had after the Taif Accord, Hezbollah had said that they could be armed because they were trying to liberate that strip of southern Lebanon that was held by the Israelis. And there was consensus on the part of the other Lebanese parties that, okay, we'll look the other way. Hezbollah can have their guns. After the Israelis withdraw in 2000, the Hezbollah then says, no, we're going to stay fighting the Israelis until all of Lebanon is liberated, and that includes the Sheba farms. So that is an issue that would linger on in Lebanon in the 2000s and then even up to today. People who condemn in Lebanon, who condemn Hezbollah for being an armed force and continue to have their own armed militia, they also will condemn the Israelis who are continuing to occupy the Sheba farms. So that is a local issue that outside of Lebanon you hardly ever hear of. But it did give Hezbollah the legitimacy in the eyes of many Lebanese until we're going to get to when they lose it. And that's when they provoked the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in, I think, 2000 in 2006. Right? I have to look at my own list because I can't keep all the dates straight in my own head. I can remember them more or less sequentially, but I can't remember them in the dates. All right, so we get pretty much a stalemate after the Camp David Accords. And during that, then, after that fails in the summer. In September, Ariel Sharon, who had been a general, remember he had been convicted of helping the Lebanese Christian militias take out, do the massacres at Sabra and Shatila and the Palestinian refugee camps in Beirut in September of 1982. He had basically gotten a slap on the wrist, but he was convicted by an Israeli court for being allowing it to happen, not to have been planning it or responsible in a direct way, but looking the other way when it happened. He then he challenges Likud, and he pushed himself forward as the, I forget what his party was called at that time. I don't know, maybe he was challenging, Netanyahu that's right, because he forms it later forms his own party. So he's challenging Netanyahu for leadership of Likud. And he goes and visits the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the mosque, very famous mosque in Jerusalem. There are two parts of it. There's one that's called the Dome of the Rock, which is the lovely one that's kind of an octagonal mosque with a golden dome. And the other larger mosque is called the Aqsa Mosque. The Dome of the Rock is on a platform, and then they're all elevated because they're on what the Jews call the Temple Mount, the site where the temple built by Solomon once stood. So for Jews, it's sacred, holy. For Muslims, it's holy because the Muslim tradition is that the Prophet Muhammad, when he went on his night journey, which is part of his story, that he goes up into heaven and he sees Jesus and Moses, and then comes back down. So it's very similar to the Christian tradition of Jesus being taken up into heaven during the Lent period, during the 40 days in the desert, and it's called the Transfiguration, and he is taken up into heaven and meets with the prophets. And so this story, it makes the Holy Mount, what is Holy Mount for the Jews, as the site of the temple. For the Muslims, it's holy because it is the site of where Muhammad went up to heaven. And the reason why the Dome of the Rock is called the Dome of the Rock is that in the center of the Dome of the Rock is a large stone which has footprints, horse prints, on it. And that Muslims believe was left when Muhammad's magic horse went up into heaven. Anyway, so it's holy to both. Now, why his visiting was problematic. One, he came with an armed guard, and it's supposed to be demilitarized. Second is that the more extreme Jews, among the religious Jews, they have been planning to blow up the mosque of the Dome of the Rock so that the temple of Solomon can be rebuilt so that the Messiah will come. So there was tunneling under it. Israelis said it's for archaeology. Muslims felt that it was trying to undermine the foundation of the Temple Mount, and that the mosque would collapse. And so it sparked a second Intifada. And this time, the PLO lost control of it. PLO kept pushing for nonviolent Intifada, and there were clashes between PLO police and demonstrators. Because what happened is you now have Hamas, and Hamas is saying that they want, the complete elimination of Israel. And you have another radical group called Islamic Jihad, which also is seeking the extinction of Israel. And so you start to have attacks on Israeli civilians in Israel proper. And this is a much bloodier Intifada. There are bombs, both car bombs, and more often, because the car bomb, the Israelis have control, it's harder for Palestinians to get cars into Israel. You get individual suicide bombers. And this is, remember, at this point, the Arabs were doing a lot of the really low level work in Israel, the garbage men, the workers in restaurants. And so there were a lot of Palestinians who were coming into Israel from both Gaza and the West Bank. In fact, it probably was as high as 25% of the Palestinian workforce was working in Israel. And so there are lots of deaths. And again, they're disputed who was a victim, in this. Palestinians don't count Israeli soldiers. Israelis count almost all male Palestinians between the age of 20 and 40 as being guerrillas. But the rough estimates are that unlike the first Intifada, where there were very few Israeli civilian casualties, this one there was well over 1,000 Israelis were killed. And I would say, I would have to go look at the statistics, but I think it's almost as many Israeli civilians as Israeli soldiers, and around 5,000 Palestinians are killed. More is mass incarceration. It's estimated by Palestinian and also non-Palestinian people who work on the UN and NGOs who work in the West Bank. It's estimated during this period that 1 out of 3 Palestinian males is incarcerated. Israel did not have to try them. They can just arrest them and hold them without trial. And so they just rounded up basically young men between the ages of 20 and 40. And as I said, it's estimated that as much as a third of the male population of the West Bank and Gaza under the age of 40 served time in Israeli jails. Women were only arrested infrequently, although there were women arrested. And I think it's something like 5% of the women of the West Bank and Gaza were imprisoned. So it was a very violent time, and it then justified for the Israelis, one, the expulsion of Arab workers from Israel proper, so the closing off of Gaza and the closing off of the West Bank, and then this then led to the building of the walls, the security wall that Israel calls, and they started it, and they said it areas where Palestinians were crossing, but eventually, as you look at a map, it's almost all the West Bank now is sealed off. There are a few sections that aren't, but it's mostly sealed off. And it included large areas of settlement. So de facto, it was following the borders that the Israelis had put forward in the Camp David peace talks in 2000. They were making them real. And this is something the Zionist movement has always talked about, making facts real on the ground. If you make them real on the ground, then they become permanent. And so the wall then was built, including large sections of Palestinian territory, what would have been Palestinian territory had there been a Palestinian state in the West Bank as part of Israel, annexed to Israel in effect. Although Israel doesn't technically do that until, actually now, Netanyahu has a mandate from parliament that if he wants to, he can annex all of those territories into the state of Israel. He already has the mandate from the parliament. They haven't done it as yet. And also Trump has said he doesn't care if they do. If they annex them, that's fine with him. He said that last year, so 2019, he made that statement. So you basically don't have any movement. You have a stalemate. The Palestinian Arafat dies. He died in, let's see, we'll get that, in Let's see, when did he die? Thought I had that written down. Oh, there, 2004. Um, uh, you have two things. I mean, well, he dies, sorry. But more than that, you have Sharon has then won. Remember, I said he had gone to the Temple Mount in an attempt to win control of the Likud party, which he did. So it may have started the Intifada, but because of the Intifada and the violence, he was seen as a strong man, and he then won the election for head of Likud, and then Likud won the election for um, prime minister. I mean, they had enough people in the parliament to name the prime minister. So he does something really dramatic, and that after he's elected, he then says that he's going to pull out of the Gaza Strip, and he does. And he dismantles Israeli settlements. There weren't that many, half a dozen or so. He sends in the army and takes them apart. And there's a lot of demonstrations in Israel by the right against him. And it is kind of this kind of a change of heart, just like Sadat had seen, the writing on the wall that there had to be a peace treaty. Sharon comes up with a formula that says that Israel can either be greater Israel, in which case it won't be democratic because it will include millions of Palestinians who aren't given the right to vote. So they are non-citizens in a territory which under international law is in fact illegal. Or it could be a Jewish state, much and democratic and much smaller. And so he puts forward the idea that, which would be anathema to the religious Greater Israel people, that we have to take limitations. So this goes back, go back to the whole Zionist view that back in 47, that they would accept partition because any Jewish state was better than no Jewish state, even a smaller Jewish state than what they wanted. Sharon is saying that there is a limit to what the Israeli Jewish state, and for him, Israel is the Jewish state. Let's make that very clear. Israel is the Jewish state. So if Israel is to be the Jewish state, it has to have the majority of its population Jewish. And that if it's greater Israel, that is everything between the West Bank and the Mediterranean, it's very tenuous. And I'll talk a little just a minute about that. How tenuous is that? So he says it's better to let it go, better to let it be under a Palestinian administration that has no army, and that we have control to its access. So, for example, if there were a West Bank state with Gaza, Israel would control the airspace, and then also they have inspections on things coming in, so weapons can't be smuggled in to this mini Palestinian state. And that's an amazing change for someone who's on the right. Likud rejects him, and he then forms his own party, which is called Kadima, which in Hebrew means forward. And it includes some of the right, but also some of the center, because people in Israel now are coming up with what is frequently used. I mean, it was back in clearly the Camp David Accords was pushing for what's what we call the two-state solution. That the only way for the settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli problem is to create two sovereign states, a Jewish state called Israel and an Arab state, Palestine. And that is what the most, I think, reasonable people around the world still hope for, although the demographics and everything else are making it much more complicated. All right, so we go back to Sharon. So Sharon, being this strong guy, he probably is the kind of guy that could have done it. As I said, under his rule, it seems to be moving towards some kind of a settlement. In other words, he's willing to negotiate with the Palestinians, partly because Arafat has died. That was back in 2003. No, 2000 and, oh, in 2003, there were elections among the Palestinians, and a new man came in, was elected, Mahmoud Abbas. And Mahmoud Abbas had been in the West Bank all along, and so the Israelis felt he was someone they could deal with. He had not been linked to Fatah terrorism. And so he could be kind of an elder statesman for the Palestinians. So when he became president of the Palestinian Authority, then the Palestinian, or Sharon felt he could negotiate. So there was some negotiations. Arafat dies. He's put under house arrest first by the Israelis, and then he developed cancer, and he goes to Paris, and he dies there. And now there's again controversy. Autopsy was done by the French. They say he was poisoned. He was radiation poisoning killed him. So someone actually brought in radiation and poisoned him. Now, whether it was Palestinians or whether it was Israelis, it isn't. They didn't make a statement. But he was poisoned by the radiation poisoning killed Arafat. And Sharon then takes. Mahmoud Abbas is the clear head of it. But then in elections, among the Palestinians, the Hamas wins. And so what happens is that basically Fatah refuses to give up in the West Bank. It got the majority of votes in the West Bank because the Hamas won overwhelmingly in Gaza. And there's roughly the same number of people living in Gaza as in the West Bank, about 2 million each. Well, maybe a little more in the West Bank, because the total number of Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank is over 5 million. What you have is a fracture of the Palestinian government. Gaza remains under Hamas control, and the West Bank is under Fatah control. There haven't been any elections since then, and that's why you have Mahmoud Abbas, whose nickname is Abu Mazen, and so a lot of people, both Israelis and American politicians, call him Abu Mazen. I don't know why. I mean, it's not. Most Palestinians call him President Abbas. I mean, it's a kind of familiarity. If you know somebody well, you call him Abu, and then whatever his name of his son is. If he's too young to have a son, you call him Abu, whatever his father's name is, because the assumption is that his firstborn son will be named after his father. So Abu Mazen, his oldest son, is Mazen. So the Israelis and the Americans both called him Abu Mazen. Palestinians wouldn't do that unless he was their, they knew him. It's too familiar. The Arabs kind of great at that. I think it's being way too familiar for both Israeli politicians and American politicians to call him Abu Mazen. But they do. They listen to Carter, you listen to people in Carter's administration, they always say Abu Mazen, this. And they make it sound like that's because he's their buddy. But like I said, for Palestinians themselves, it's not. It kind of grates on their ear that they're using that familiarity. But anyway, Mahmoud Abbas then, now he's in his mid-80s. And there isn't any young leadership, which is another problem with the system. There hasn't been an election, so there are people, younger generation, who might eventually emerge, but now there isn't. So you have an aged leadership in the West Bank, and you have a very radical leadership in the Gaza. And so then you have the dates here. I don't want to go through all of them, but there then is another Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which is in 2006, because the Hezbollah shooting rockets into Israel. And so Israel attacks this time, as they did in 2000, but it's much worse. They bomb Lebanese infrastructure. They bomb Beirut heavily. They don't hit the only civilian targets they hit are the Shia neighborhoods in the south are bombed. The rest of the civilian targets aren't hit, but the airports are hit, the bridges are hit, roads are hit. And it's terrific damage to Lebanon. And the Lebanese people at this point say it's the fault of Hezbollah. And there is a cooling. And Hezbollah still is armed. I mentioned that in the lecture on Lebanon. It's still armed, but the Lebanese government has tried to move, although it's hard because the Hezbollah controls about 40% of the parliament. So it's hard for them to move against it. But among non-Shia Muslims, like when, for example, during the demonstrations that were taking place in Lebanon in the fall before the coronavirus hit, they were against the government. Unspoken is they were against the fact that Hezbollah had so much power in the government. And you had Christians and Sunni Muslims and Druzes. So everybody that wasn't Shia was demonstrating against the government. And that was code for the role that Hezbollah has in the government, because Hezbollah still is armed. And there is a lot of anger in Lebanon. I was there this time last year, and I talked to a lot of Lebanese, and everyone who wasn't Shia were all unified in their idea that Hezbollah has to disarm. But because of the sectarian way of government, it's not feasible anytime soon. But it did break the popularity of Hezbollah, and Hezbollah now is seen as the problem rather than the solution to Lebanon's struggle with Israel. So that changed. But also then you have periodic attacks from Gaza. So you have periods when the radicals in Gaza shoot rockets at the Israelis, and the Israelis respond, and that has gone back and forth. As I said, once Sharon, I didn't mention, Sharon had a stroke, and once Sharon had a stroke, and that was in 2006, he did not die until quite a long bit later. But he was once he had a stroke, he was on life support and never gained consciousness. So Likud then, Kadima goes on, I think it wins one more election, and then it kind of disappears. And then Likud comes back, and it's under Sharon. And so Sharon then takes the hard line. He is a prime minister from 2009 on. So 11 years, he's been prime minister nonstop. He's had lots of challenges. He has a challenge today in the sense that he has been indicted for corruption. As you know, the Israelis the Israelis have had 3 elections in basically a year and a half, and it's always stalemated between a new center party led by another general and Likud. And then Likud has its allies in the religious parties and in the settler parties, the parties that represent the settlers. So I want to stop with that discussion of Palestinians and Israelis and go briefly to Israel itself and the demographic, some people say demographic time bomb, that is Israel has faced. And that is that Israel today is about 8 million people. I didn't get the figures, you can look it up, it's over 8 million. Of that 8 million, 20%, a little over 1 million, a couple 100,000 are Israeli Arabs. So they are people who are Israeli citizens, but are not full citizens, because under Israeli law, many things are available to you if you are a veteran of the army. Most all Israeli men and women, other than Arabs and the ultra-religious, serve in the army. So that means you all get benefits that the Arab population doesn't get. So there are limits on it. They can vote, and technically they're eligible for health care and all this stuff, but it is a, just as in the United States, well, in the United States, we don't have national health care. But if we did have national health care, you could imagine that it would be unequal, that there would be areas, just like school systems are in the United States, are supposedly state-run and supposedly equal, but we all know that in low-income areas, the state schools aren't as good. There's not as much resources going into the schools. Well, that's the way it is with the Arabs. So the Arabs in Israel have government-funded schools. They have government-funded healthcare, but it's below the level that the Jewish population gets. It's benign neglect. In part because the Arabs a lot of them don't vote because they don't think it's legitimate that the Israeli government controls their lives. Others, they say, well, we've been under the situation for so long, why bother voting? Lately, they've been organizing, and in fact, in the last election, the reason why Netanyahu did not get a clear majority was the Arab turnout was 17%. Now they're roughly 20% of the population. So 17% of the voters were Arabs. So that meant that they almost turned out in the number of their population, and that prevented Likud from getting a clear majority. So you have that Arab population. If you add that Arab population of Israel to the Arabs who live in Palestine, to the Palestinian territories, Gaza and the West Bank, you get roughly equal the number of Jews. So the number of Jews, the number of Arabs who live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean is roughly equal. The only Jewish population that is reproducing itself in terms of birth is the religious population, which is about 10 to 20% of the Israeli Jewish population. No, take it back. 10 to 20% of the Israeli total population is religious Jews, ultra-religious Jews, who do have high birth rates. Their birth rates are roughly equivalent to that of the Palestinians. But there are, if you take all the Palestinian territories and the Israeli Arabs, you get a birth rate of Arab birth rate that's about double that of the Jewish birth rate. So this is what Jewish politicians in Israel, especially the center and the left, call the demographic time bomb, that there will soon be a time when Arab population is going to outnumber the Jewish population. And so what do? We need to have the two-state solution. Go back to Sharon's idea, we could have a greater Israel, but it won't be democratic. We could have a Jewish Israel that is democratic, but it has to be smaller. So the two-state solution is well, as I said, most people who aren't partisan completely on one side or the other, and many people who are partisan on one side or the other, both people who are sympathetic to Israel and some people sympathetic to Palestinians. They recognize that the two-state solution is the only viable solution. But is it a possibility? And this is the problem. The problem is that with the tenuousness of the Israeli coalition system, the religious parties and the settler parties have significant weight in the same way that in the Republican Party, you could say the very conservative people have a significant weight. They have a greater weight than they would have demographically because of their position, or you could say that also with Senate. Conservative, low population states have a weighted advantage over large populated states. And under the Israeli system, then the small parties do have a weighted advantage, and they're totally opposed to any kind of thing. So what do you have left? You have either a perpetual Israeli occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, which is what seems like Likud wants. They hope that the population will leave. They will immigrate, and because there's almost no job opportunities. The only jobs since once the second Intifada, which is sometimes called the Aqsa Intifada because of the fact that it started when Sharon went to visit the Aqsa Mosque. The Aqsa meant that no Palestinians are going in, and that meant that Israelis had to bring in outside labor, and this is when Israel starts to bring in labor from Ethiopia, from Thailand, from all kinds of places, brought in to do the work that the Palestinians had been doing in Israel. Basically low-paying jobs are done in Israel today by imported labor, some even from Romania, from poor countries in Europe. But Ethiopians, Kenyans, Thais, Filipinos, those are all brought into Israel in fairly large numbers. Tens of thousands of workers are working in Israel from outside of Israel. Those were jobs that used to be done by the Palestinians. So there isn't a lot of opportunity in Palestine. There had been optimism in the 90s. Palestinians in America had invested heavily in trying to create an industrial infrastructure, nothing else, food manufacturing and things like that. But that has all failed since then with Israeli impositions of various barriers and customs barriers and exports and various things. That's all pretty much failed. So the Israelis are hoping that, or the right wing of Israelis are hoping that the Palestinians will leave. And that has worked with the Christians. The Christian population of Palestine in 1947 was roughly 10% of the Arab population. Oh, take it back. Of the total population, it's 10% was Palestinian. Christians. Among the Palestinians today, it's less than 2%. And that's because Christians tended to be better educated, they had relatives outside, they had networks outside, and so they have been immigrating. And so the idea that the Arab population of the West Bank would leave has held true for Christians, but not for Muslims. Some Muslims went to Jordan, especially after the 67 war, but since then there hasn't been that many Palestinians leaving, because in part the Palestinians have organized what they call the resistance to the Israeli occupation by staying. And the word they use is samud. Samud means hanging tough, not violence, just hanging in there. Just by being here, we are resisting the Israeli occupation. And so just our physical presence here means that Palestine won't disappear. So that the idea that the Palestinians will leave is I think that moment has passed. And so the Israelis will have to face the fact that they have to deal with a Palestinian population. Now they're under control now. Gaza is still a place where the Hamas is in control and continues to launch rockets. But every time they do that, the Israeli response is so much worse that, I can see a day where Hamas will lose. If they hold elections in Gaza, I can see a day where the Gazans will say, no, we don't want this anymore. It's just, you're bringing our self-destruction. Same way the Lebanese feel about Hezbollah, you're bringing our destruction by attacking Israel. So that may eventually work, quiet Gaza down, but you still have that population, and it still has the potential, always the potential of exploding at some point. So two-state is the one most people are hoping for. They don't see how it's possible, but they are hoping for that. The other is the thing that the left has now taken up again, and that is the one-state solution. And this is a very, it goes back to some of the leftist Zionists in the 1940s. They put forward that idea that Palestine shouldn't be partitioned, it should be one state for Jews and Arabs. Unfortunately, there were no Arabs on the other side who would accept that in 1947. But there were Jewish intellectuals who said, let's have a one-state solution where it's not a Jewish state, it's where Arabs and Jews have equal voice in the state. And that would be, leftists are putting that forward now. They're saying, let's have a democratic, non-Jewish state. And this is why Israel has become, the right-wing party in Israel has become so intransigent about calling everybody has to accept we're a Jewish state. We're a Jewish state, we're a Jewish state. The Palestinians must say we're a Jewish state. We aren't going to talk to them until they say we're a Jewish state. And the Palestinians are saying, you're whatever state you want to be. It isn't up to us to call you a Jewish state. If you want to call yourselves a Jewish state, call yourselves a Jewish state. So the Palestinian leadership is sticking to the idea of Palestine as a state, Israel as a state. Israel as a state, if it wants to be Jewish, it's up to the Israelis. It's no business of the Palestinians to tell the Israelis whether they're a Jewish state or not. So the right in Israel it's very hysterical about the idea of one state, non-national state, because it would mean an Arab majority within 50 years. So clearly, I personally don't think that, given the Israeli experience and the Jewish experience outside of Israel, I don't think it is logical. Maybe in 100 years, I don't know, but I just don't think it's logical to expect a one-state solution given the Israeli history. I would think Palestinians obviously would probably welcome it because they know that demography is on their side. So that's where we leave it. It's still very bleak. As I said, what one of the holds had been on the Israelis had been the American administration. George H.W. Bush, a Republican, is the only American president ever to not go through with money that Congress had voted to Israel. He did that back in 1991. And that was money that they would go for the support of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And he then held up all of the money going to Israel. And it was, quite a lot of money, well over $3 billion a year the United States has sent to Israel. Israel is over half of the foreign aid the United States gives to the world. Over half of it goes to Israel. He held it up because he said the Israelis have to stop any settlements. And they did. And they stopped them all the way from that point up until 2010. Then they started again under Likud. And then now they have the green light from Trump. So Trump says they can build as many settlements as they want, and not only that, if they want to annex them, they can. So that's it. And also Trump moved, the American position had been that Jerusalem had to be settled by the Palestinians and the Israelis. The Americans always said that they were in favor of a unified Jerusalem, but they weren't going to say it publicly, and they weren't going to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel until the peace treaty had been signed between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and they had worked out what the status of Jerusalem would be. And then again, Trump has done away with that. We've recognized a unified Jerusalem, so all the Arab parts of Jerusalem we recognize as being annexed by Israelis. We also, under Trump, recognized the Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights. During the Bush administration, it looked the first Bush, not the second. Under the first Bush administration, it was very close. The Syrians were very close to signing a peace treaty with the Israelis if the Israelis would get out, or at least make a token withdrawal from the Golan Heights. So Syria almost became after the Madrid conference, Syria almost became a peace, willing to sign a peace treaty with Israel over the Golan Heights. That now is forever off the table, partly because of the Syrian civil war, but also because Israel's annexed it. So it's now officially part of Israel. It's as much part of Israel as is Tel Aviv. So there's no chance that Syria would ever get the Golan Heights back. So that's a kind of a bleak, I mean, it's not, what I find interesting about the whole thing, because I went into study Middle East studies, because, as I mentioned earlier in the class, because of the 67 war. And so the 67 war meant that Americans, everybody in the world interested in the Middle East, was largely because of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And during the 1980s and the 1990s, most of the students who took this class, that is Introduction to Modern Middle East, they were interested in the Arab-Israeli conflict, and they were either partisan one side or the other. That has fallen off because obviously the Middle East has become so much more of so many other problems with terrorism, the American occupations of Iraq, and the whole Syrian civil war. I mean, so many things have happened that people don't pay any attention to the Israeli-Palestinian question. It has become low on the interest rate of people outside of those two people themselves, even within the Arab world. There are so many other problems that Arabs are worried about that Palestinians are pretty low down on their list of priorities. And so it has meant that the Palestinians and the Israelis have to work it out themselves, which I guess is something that is true, should have been true all along. And unfortunately, I can't be very optimistic at present about there being a change. If Likud does really badly and people in the center, because, I mean, I guess let's leave with an optimistic note. That since I'm starting to feel very pessimistic, let me leave with an optimistic note. And the optimistic note is that the polling done by Israelis, of Israeli voters, and polling done by Palestinians shows that still the majority, it's a slim majority. It used to be a whopping majority. Now it's a slim majority, but there still is in most polls, there's some that disagree, but most polls show that the majority of Palestinians and the majority of Israelis want a two-state solution. So I will leave it there on an optimistic note, sort of optimistic note, that I hope in your lifetimes, I'm pretty sure I won't see it in my lifetime, but I hope in your lifetimes there will be a two-state solution, and that Palestinians and Israelis can live in two contiguous states in peace. So I leave that with you, and I say goodbye until the next lecture, which again is a depressing lecture because it's on the American involvement in Iraq. But there are depressing stories in the Middle East, unfortunately we have to tell them. So be well, stay healthy, and I'll see you soon.